Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Christina Nosti, Director of Events at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and tonight it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to an evening with Mitchell Kaplan and Rachel DeWoskin to celebrate the publication of Paul Auster's new novel, Baumgartner, published by our friends at Atlantic Monthly Press. A new work by Paul Auster is a literary event, and tonight we join forces with Miami Book Fair, Books and Books at the Studios of Key West, Community Bookstore, Politics and Prose, Prairie Lights, The King's English, Seminary Co-op, and Book Passage to explore Auster's brilliant 18th novel, which the New York Times Book Review calls contemporary American writing at its best. Paul Auster is the best-selling author of 4321, Sunset Park, The Book of Illusions, Moon Palace, and the New York Trilogy, among many other works. In 2006, he was awarded the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature. His other honors include the Independent Spirit Award for the screenplay of Smoke, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Burning Boy, and the Carlos Fuentes Prize for his body of work. Unfortunately, Paul is unable to join us on this broadcast, but stepping in to discuss his new work are Mitchell Kaplan and Rachel DeWoskin. Mitchell and Rachel serve with Paul on the steering committee of Writers for Democratic Action and have become fast friends. Mitchell is the founder of Books and Books and the co-founder of Miami Book Fair. Rachel is the author of Absolute Animal Poems and many other books, and is on the core creative writing faculty at the University of Chicago. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Christina. And hi, Rachel. How are you?
Hi, Mitch. I'm well. I'm glad to be here with you. Thanks, Christina.
Listen, I know all of you out there were expecting Paul to be here tonight. But as you can see, it's only me and Rachel. Paul's been pretty exhausted these days. He's being treated for cancer, and those treatments can be intense. But instead of canceling tonight, Rachel and I, and Paul as well, still wanted to celebrate the publication of this very beautiful and tender and astonishing novel of his. I've read nothing like it in years. Today is its pub day, a kind of birthday. And it's our hope that tonight we can help amplify Paul's voice, even in his absence. Amplify his voice, his art, and his incredible empathy. All cause for celebration. And we want the world to meet Baumgartner. This is Baumgartner. Today is its birthday, right here. Baumgartner, with a beautiful photograph from Paul's son-in-law, Spencer Ostrander. It's really quite a remarkable looking book. You're going to hear tonight a bit from us, and we're going to talk. We're going to read. We're going to discuss Paul, discuss his work, and then afterwards, what I want all of you to do is go out to your local indie bookstore and buy many, 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 many copies of Baumgartner. You won't be sorry. You know, the holidays are just around the corner, and I can't think of a better gift. Forgive me. That's kind of the bookseller in me speaking. And by the way, there's much, much to be hopeful about in the treatment Paul's receiving. And both Rachel and I and all of us are looking forward to reprising this evening one day soon, but with Paul's presence. So, Rachel, what do you think? I think I'm going to start by reading the beginning of the book to give people kind of a taste of what Paul has done here in this very slim but powerful volume. And the beginning introduces us to Baumgartner himself, to Psy, as he's referred to in the book. And I'll just read a little bit from it. And hopefully this gives you some idea of its flavor. Baumgartner is sitting at his desk in the second floor room he variously refers to as his study, his cogitorium, and his hole. Pen in hand, he is midway through a sentence in the third chapter of his monograph on Kierkegaard's pseudonyms, when it occurs to him that the book he needs to quote from in order to finish the sentence is downstairs in the living room, where he left it before going to bed last night. On the way downstairs to retrieve the book, it also occurs to him that he promised to call his sister this morning at 10 o'clock. And since it is almost 10 now, he decides that he will go into the kitchen and make the call before retrieving the book from the living room. When he walks into the kitchen, however, he is stopped in his tracks by a sharp, stinging smell. Something is burning, he realizes, and as he advances toward the stove, he sees that one of the front burners has been left on, and that a low, persistent flame is eating its way into the bottom of the small aluminum pot he used 3 hours ago to cook his breakfast of 2 soft-boiled eggs. He turns off the burner, and then, without thinking twice, that is, without bothering to fetch a pot holder or a towel, he lifts the destroyed, smoldering egg boiler off the stove and scalds his hand. Baumgartner cries out in pain. A fraction of a second later, he drops the pot, which hits the floor with an abrupt clattering ping. And then, still yelping in pain, he rushes over to the sink, turns on the cold water, sticks his right hand under the spout, and holds it there for the next 3 or 4 minutes as the chilly stream pours down over his skin. Hoping he has warded off any potential blisters on his fingers and palm, Baumgartner cautiously dries off his hand with a dish towel, pauses for a moment to flex his fingers, pats his hand with the towel a couple of more times, and then asks himself what he is doing in the kitchen. Before he can remember that he is supposed to be calling his sister, the telephone rings. He lifts the receiver off the hook and mumbles forth a guarded hello. His sister, he says to himself, finally remembering why he is here, and now that it is past 10 and he's failed to call her, he fully expects Naomi to be the person on the other end of the line, his cantankerous younger sister, who will no doubt begin the conversation by scolding him for having forgotten to call her again, as he always does. But once the person on the other end begins to speak, it turns out not to be Naomi, but a man, an unknown man, with an unfamiliar voice, who is stammering out some sort of apology to him for being late. Late for what? Baumgartner asks. To read your meter, the man says. I was supposed to be there at 9, remember? No, Baumgartner doesn't remember. He can't recall a single moment in the past days or weeks when he thought the meter reader from the electric company was scheduled to be there at 9. And therefore he tells the man not to worry about it. He plans to be home all morning and afternoon, but the electric company man, who sounds young and inexperienced and eager to please, insists on explaining that he has no time to explain just now why he didn't show up on time, but there was a good reason for it, a reason beyond his control, and that he will be there as soon as he can. Fine, Baumgartner says. I'll see you then. He hangs up and looks down at his right hand, which has begun to throb from the burn. But when he examines his palm and fingers, he sees no signs of blistering or peeling skin, just a general sort of redness. Not so bad, he thinks. I can live with that. And then, addressing himself in the second person, he thinks, you stupid ass. Consider yourself lucky. That's Baumgartner. That's Sigh. That's quite an opening, Rachel, isn't it? It drew me
It's
right in. Drew me
absolutely delightful. It's delightful. A tiny spoiler is only a moment later he falls down the stairs after the meter reader does arrive. And it's funny, I mean, the granularity of it gives such a sense of being on an actual tour of a human imagination and life. Every tiny texture and detail, and it's so funny and so heartbreaking, and just has a core of almost indescribable sweetness and humanity, which is what Paul himself is like, I think. He's so philosophical and profound a thinker and person, and he's deeply kind and quite mischievous, like the novel. I'm going to read a very brief section from page 59 in case anyone's following along in a galley. This is a little bit more of a whimsical moment, or a magical moment, you might say. Baumgartner sits down in the chair behind the desk. I should say that he's mourning the death of his wife, whom he lost in a drowning accident 9 years before the novel takes place, or before the present tense thread of the novel takes place. A moment after he has settled his ass into a comfortable position, the telephone rings. The red telephone. The disconnected telephone that cannot ring, but nevertheless has rung and is continuing to ring still. Both frightened and curious, Baumgartner understands that the sounds from the ringing phone are the same sounds he heard while lying in his bed upstairs, the same alternating sequence of longer and shorter intervals of sound and silence, faint and muffled on the second floor, but loud and clear on the first. And if that is the case, then whatever person or prankster or invisible agent had called earlier is now calling again. Baumgartner lifts the receiver off the hook and hazards an uncertain, bewildered hello, a hello with a question mark attached to it. A silence follows, during which he tells himself that he must be dreaming, even though he is awake and cannot be dreaming. And then Anna is talking to him with the same resonant voice that belonged to her when she was alive, addressing him as darling and my darling man, explaining to him that death is not what anyone had ever imagined it was, that the two of them and all the other materialists had been wrong to assume there is no afterlife, but that the afterlives of the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and all the others have gotten it wrong as well. There are no divine punishments or rewards, no trumpets or fires of perdition, no bowers of heavenly bliss, and no human being will ever go back to earth as a butterfly, a crocodile, or Marilyn Monroe. What happens after death is that you enter the great nowhere, a black space in which nothing is visible, a soundless vacuum of nullity, the oblivion of the void. There is no contact with any other dead person, and no ambassador from on high or down low comes to brief you on what will be happening next. She therefore has no idea how long her present condition will last, if present is a relevant term anymore in a place such as this one, which is not even a place, but a nowhere, a blank null subtracted from an infinity of nulls. She sees nothing and hears nothing because she has no body anymore, no extension, as the old philosophers used to put it, which means that she is never tired or hungry or feels any pain or pleasure or anything at all. And if she could be measured in space, if such a term as space is relevant anymore, she is probably no bigger than a subatomic particle, the merest, most minuscule fraction of the cosmic what. Call her a what, if he likes, or a spirit, or an emanation of the vast, formless surround, or quite simply, a monad that thinks. And when she thinks, it sometimes happens that she can see the things she is imagining, see them clearly in her mind's eye, if she had such things as a mind or an eye anymore, which she doesn't, but nevertheless, she can see them clearly, almost as clearly as she once did when she was alive on Earth. Baumgartner says nothing. He wants to talk. He wants to tell her 100 things and ask her 100 questions, but he seems to have lost the power to open his mouth and speak. No matter, he says to himself, the call could end abruptly at any moment, and why bother to talk when all he wants is to go on listening to Anna's voice until the time runs out and she vanishes into the darkness again.
What a beautifully read, Rachel, and what an amazing love story this is as well. Ultimately, at the basis of all of it is this incredible love and mourning and a sense of loss that is kind of that is reflected off of what seems like a kind of banal, domestic life, but it's really not. The richness of this interior life, Paul is able to bring out so beautifully, I thought.
I thought so too. And I too felt that the depiction of marriage was like nothing I've read before. My husband, who's a playwright, once described a married couple, us, in fact, as one feeble bisected brain. And I was thinking, even reading that passage where Anna calls him, or where his love for her is so acute and his grief is so fresh, even 9 years after losing her, that he conjures her in his own mind. And I was thinking how part of what's so beautiful and funny in the depiction of their marriage and their early love is that they're a kind of bisected brain, maybe in this case, not feeble, but that they share thoughts and they share writing. And, so much of the book is about him, Baumgartner, excavating Anna's work, finding her again through her poetry, through his imagination, through her imagination. And it's really a deep, deep depiction of the ways in which two human beings can love one another.
And the connection is brought out so beautifully too in the device that Paul uses, with the whole idea of, the the loss of a limb and what happens when you lose a limb, and that sense of feeling pain still. And that, I think, also speaks to what you're saying about how close and connected they really were.
It definitely does. I also love the way when he talks about phantom limb syndrome, that it's one of Cy Baumgartner's research
Right.
hobbies to think about this.
Exactly.
I mean, he's such a philosophizing guy and he has so many various interests. And the way that Paul examines those interests it's so much fun. The book it's sweet and profound and difficult, but it's also just full of fun
I
and
think
sort of lighthearted imaginings.
when we were talking about it earlier, I remember you saying that it it really captures so many of the different devices that Paul uses in his writing throughout all of his work, right? It's all captured within this 200-page novel.
Absolutely. It's complete, it's virtuosic the way he does it. And
Yeah.
at times it feels funny. I mean, I think he knows that he's on fire writing this book. And so the poetry is amazing. He writes Anna's poetry. He writes her early versions of their love story. It's full of all sorts of genre work and it's full of very, very realistic fiction, like burning the hand and falling down the stairs and the meter guy
Oh,
showing up and talking and talking. And then it's also full of these deeply intellectually curious and philosophical flights, flights of wonder, flights of fancy, flights of research. So it feels iconic of Paul's work, I think.
and we're also taken through time through these reminiscences. We're taken back many, many, many decades through their relationship, through her poetry, through his rediscovering of her journals, which I thought, I got chills reading those journals. I think it may be an advertisement for people not to write journals, thinking that
Yeah.
someone will discover them later on. But that whole idea of memory and what memory is to this older man, I think that's what, as I get older, not too much, not too much younger than what Cy was, this whole idea of memory, this idea of the colliding of memory and time and space and not being linear, and sometimes being 40 years ago, sometimes being 30 years ago, sometimes being today. It all exists at the same time. And I think that's what we see in this. It's really, for some reason, it struck me as so wise and so mature in the whole notion of how one ages as well.
I think so, and deeply authentic. It feels like an authentic kaleidoscopic portrait of a human being moving through his days and moving in and out of his own memory and his own life. It reminds me of some lines in an Anne Carson poem. The Canadian poet Anne Carson has this poem called The Glass Essay. And she talks about how the hardest thing about losing a lover is to watch the year repeat its days. She says it's as if you can feel that year running underneath this one like an old videotape, and you can kind of dip down into it and pull up other seasons and other years. And I felt that so acutely in this. And it's definitely part of the wisdom of the work. And it's often meta. I mean, Paul notes when it's happening in a very funny, writerly way. But it's also, I think, why you get chills. I mean, you described having chills. It feels like your own memories. It's so easy to inhabit Sai's life and feelings about things, and his pulling Anna's ghost close and then pushing Anna's ghost away so that he can remain alive and remain in the present tense and on the planet himself. Actually reminds me of what the New York Times wrote in its review. This is a beautiful line in Fiona's review from today. The novel walks us through what he thinks about, and more important, how he thinks, how his thoughts assemble and fall apart, how they produce a kind of cumulative power that dissipates just as powerfully in the face of life's little intrusions.
Yeah, that was a beautiful review. It was in today's Times, I believe. I was so happy to see that. Yeah, no, I read a review earlier, about this whole idea of the whole idea of Sai's recollections, and how it's kind of present day, and then it flips back to the decades earlier. And I guess it's what we were talking about before. This review that was in Publishers Weekly says the effect builds to a beautiful approximation of memory's fluidity and allure. I love that idea of allure of memory. So many of us try to run away from memory, but the allure of memory, when you have something really that you want to remember that was so beautiful and true, does have an allure. And they end it, which I love. They end this review by saying, this book is one, and I love it, to savor. And I think that's what I did when I put it down. I savored it. I even went back to it. I read different passages. What did you make of the idea? I was stricken by it. I was struck by it, by the fact that Paul does allude to himself in this. It's not completely autobiographical, but there is an Auster strain in Sai's family, right?
Yeah, I loved it. As soon as I came to Ruth Auster, I immediately marked it with a huge exclamation point.
Right.
And it feels, sometimes Paul's novels, they feel like treasure hunts, and partly it's about building a constellation across all of his work. But in this, again, to go back to the idea that this is an iconic, virtuosic late life triumph of his, I feel like there are these little moments of kind of just perfect Austerness, and that's one of them. And to have his own family story woven through, and fashion Trocadero, and
Yes.
the immigrant story in New York, and then the trips across the world and stuff.
Right.
These little like pods of beautiful memory, which feel true, both because they are true, and I don't mean true in the boring factual sense. I mean true in the philosophical poetic sense. They're deeply, deeply true, not just about him, but you get a little shiver of giddiness knowing that, oh, these are also autobiographical facts of his own life.
And I was thinking about this too, is that, the whole notion of Paul and magic, and the idea of, a kind of another dimension poking through every now and again, is something that has made him, and made him very early on, a favorite of all these magicians. He's like, in the magic world, Paul is, kind of a celebrity. I remember actually when 4321 came out, it turned out that it was Paul's 70th birthday. And so we decided to throw him a big birthday party in Miami when he did his appearance for that book. And David Blaine came, right?
Wow.
So David Blaine put together an entire trick just in Paul's honor for that night. It was a beautiful night. It was Sophie sang. Paul, many of you might not know, but Sophie Auster, Paul's daughter, is an amazing singer, an amazing voice. And she sang that night. And then Siri, Paul's wife, who's fed an amazing writer whom we all love as well. Siri and Paul were in conversation. It was a kind of a magical evening. But I love that idea that there are all these magicians who hang on every word, who really take to his writing as well, because there is a bit of sleight of hand in the way he writes.
There is. That's such an interesting thing. I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me that the magicians love him and that he loves magic. And I think it's especially kind of remarkable in this book that the magic is distilled into a human being. It's really just the regular magic of a mind, of having a mind that can exist in multiple universes at one time, that can hold on to what's actually lost in the world, a love or your partner, memory. I'm looking through the Q&A box. Please feel free to join in the conversation. People are saying Paul has had such a huge impact on my life.
Yeah,
This is Nikki.
I think
I pro-
celebrating Paul would be great tonight. So anybody who's got anything to say, that would be fantastic.
Oh, this is just a lovely comment about Paul. Nikki writes, I probably live in Brooklyn because of him, and especially because of reading the Brooklyn Follies when I still lived in Australia. A subconscious Paul, he's my favorite writer. Sending him strength. Can't wait to read Baumgartner. Paul, I hope you and Siri and Sophie and Spencer are here hearing this. I'm sure it's no surprise, but it's got to be nice to hear. Anyone who has a question or a comment, feel free to drop it in the chat, and Mitch and I will pull it in.
Christy Hanlon says, I'm so beyond tickled by this offering and in dire need of this brain and soul food this evening. Mr. Auster is an absolute gem, and Moon Palace, among all the others working on 4321 now, is one of my favorite reads ever. And I'm so grateful for this event and for the ability to share space and time with you all. Thank you, Mr. Auster, and thank you, Book Passage. Book Passage is a wonderful indie bookstore in Northern California, and they're one of our sponsors, one of the groups that are bringing it to us tonight as well.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Tell me some of the times that your early introduction to Paul. What were some of the earliest introductions that you had to his work? Do you recall?
Well, I read City of Glass when I was living in Beijing, and I was quite young. And then the graphic novel, the second I could get my hands on it. And I read his books, as a kid when I was really, really young and living in New York for the first time myself, and then living in Beijing. And I always felt, just profoundly connected. And I didn't meet Paul actually until I started working with Writers for Democratic Action. And then spending, every Sunday with our little scrappy radical crew, I got to see how profoundly generous he is in his political viewpoints and in his willingness to fight all the good fights and in his kind of assessment of the world. And I feel that deep generosity in Baumgartner. And I also think Paul's humble. He seems to me somebody who's asking questions of the world in a way it can't be faked. Let me put it that way.
No, and there's no cynicism. I mean, Paul, I've always had a sense of Paul as expecting really good things out of people.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the work with WDA. So for people who don't know, WDA is called Writers for Democratic Action, and all of you should go to writersfordemocraticaction.org. And even if you're not a published writer, you can be an ally and you can join up and find out about all the different things that we're all doing. This was a group that was started even before I joined. It was Paul and a bunch of Siri and a bunch of other people who got together in the days of right before or after, I think it was before the Trump election. It was an attempt to try to stop that from happening. And then the group expanded to become Writers for Democratic Action, and it does a whole bunch of different things. And it very much at the heart and soul of it are Siri and Paul, and a lot of the, a lot of the direction that this group has, has a lot to do with who they are, I think.
Okay, I want to talk for a minute about this moment on page 50 because I found it so funny. I love the plot about the excavation of work and the feeling of being a writer. I think this book is for everyone. I think it's for old people. I think it's for young people. I think it's for people who are in love. I think it's for people who wish they were in love. I think it's for people who used to be in love. And it's really, really for writers. I mean, I found it to be the opposite of loneliness. There's this hilarious moment where Sai is thinking about the fact that Anna never really published, she never really sent her poems out. She didn't publish them. And he says it was a thing that had baffled him most about her. For in all other ways, Anna was a person who stood up for herself and fought hard for what she believed in. And she knew damned well that her poems were good. Doubts, yes. Despairing moments, yes. But what writer or artist doesn't live in that shifting territory between confidence and self-contempt? I like that moment because, of course, I live in that terrible shifting territory. And I just found it funny to think that Paul and Siri also live in that shifting territory. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and as someone who's not a writer, I too live in that shifting territory as well. That's
Yeah.
what makes it very universal, I think.
So maybe it's just the human condition.
Yeah, I think it might be for so many of us, I think. Um, that's very funny. You know, I remember Paul from being a young bookseller. You know, we opened in 1982, almost 40 years ago. And one of the first books I carried home with me that I took from the bookstore was this amazing collection called the Random House Book of 20th Century Poetry that was edited by Paul. And in 1982, when it came out, I remember it was hailed and it was reviewed all over the place, front page reviews, as being one of the first complete anthologies of 20th century French poetry. It sounds kind of unbelievable that that happened first in 1982, but it did. And Paul's fingerprints are all over it. As we all know, Paul, you know, Paul and France and his love for France is all over the place. So, and then I remember another lovely time that we had, booksellers experience is like 5 minutes with a lot of different people, right? But I remember when I think it was Smoke, one of his films was showing at the Miami Film Festival, and we got to see it together, and that was really a kick for me as well. And you know, when you're in Paul's presence, even for a short time, even if it's on a Sunday afternoon, talking about the horrible politics of the day, there's a devotion that you develop that you can never be rid of, I think.
Can I ask a follow-up that actually comes from the chat? It's about the autobiographical elements of Baumgartner. And Lisa is just saying, can we expand a little bit on the autobiographical parts of the book? You know Paul well and have known him for decades.
I don't know it as well as me being able to expand on it. Plus, I think if we're not careful, there'll be too many spoiler alerts.
There'll be too many spoilers.
But a lot of the places, and as you mentioned, a lot of the backstory of his family has some real autobiographical points to it, I think. It'd be a mistake to call it autobiography, though, I believe. But I think there's the essence of it is Paul, very, very much so.
And he does name a character, Ruth Auster.
He does indeed.
Which is hard to miss. Laura Tupper has written this beautiful thing in the chat saying, what a treat to hear these excerpts. I'm thinking about granularity. It feels intimate. It makes me want to track my days, to notice, but in service of something larger. That's the challenge. And I do think that that's one of the things Paul does so well in this book, that the attentiveness, the attention to all the details of a human life and just a human day and the little intrusions and the distractions and the irritations and the phone calls and the pot and the yard and the zipper. At one point his fly is unzipped.
Right.
And those kinds of things actually, they create a life. Like profundity is just sort of a crude, banal granularity. And he does that so brilliantly that it gives a sense of what it feels like to be a human being, which is something really hard to depict in writing.
Yeah, how many of us have burnt our hands on a pot that is too hot? But none of us have taken 2.5 pages to think it through, right? We just burn our hands and just forget about it. I mean,
move on.
We move on. You're right. The granularity is something, which is really amazing. And I loved and we won't give too much away, but what happens with the meter reader and the relationship they develop. I mean, all of those things, are so beautifully, so beautifully unexpected. In someone
Yeah.
else's hands, something bizarre might have happened, but in Paul's hands, it becomes a matter of connection in a deeper way.
And the pot, of course, turns out to be a pot he's had since his first apartment with
Right,
Anna. So
right.
how do you use the pot? I mean, this book is a craft class. It's a master class for writers because you take the pot, you burn Baumgartner's hand. We get the full scope and sweep of his frailty and his kind of particular human container. And then we get his whole love story and this pot, which has existed across the decades with him, and first with his wife, and now alone with him, and now clattering on the floor as he falls downstairs. And I just think there's a way in which Paul uses all the pieces, all the elements, all the nouns, the objects, and then the textures and the words and the ways in which people speak. And he weaves it together into this totally majestic novel, which is deceptively, what did the LA Times called it? Slim and refreshing. Which I found funny and true, but I think it's deceptively slim.
Completely so. I mean, it's the kind of thing, and I keep thinking of the PW line. It's something to savor, and I'm very envious of everyone out there who hasn't read it yet, who will have this amazing book to discover, and just spend an afternoon with it and sort of crawl into it. There was something, I don't know. I mean, it's both troubling. It's a troubling novel, but at the same time, it was a novel in which you connect. You connect with humanity. I often people ask, why you read novels. Why do I read them for the cathartic nature of living someone else's life, and then identifying those things that I can identify with, and this did that amazingly. I think I felt lighter right after I read it. I think I worked out some things in my mind that I didn't even realize I had worked out. That's the effect of this, I think.
I felt that way too. And this isn't a spoiler, but the end is just a big inhalation.
Yeah. No, I
It's a
love
big gasp of oxygen right at the end, and then you
right.
leave just wanting another and another and another book. It's funny though, what you say reminds me of James Baldwin saying that thing about how he felt alone in his torments, and then he read Dickens and Dostoevsky and realized from Dickens and Dostoevsky that all the things that tormented him most were in fact the things which connected him. I think he says to everyone who is alive or who has ever been alive, which I've always found a
Yeah.
really interesting way to describe the experience of reading something that makes you feel like you're not floating
No,
by yourself out in
it's
space.
funny. It's funny that you say that because I just copied into my into my little quote list that I keep. The one good things about cell phones is you can keep it in more lists than you can possibly imagine. But I just put this in. This is Baldwin. You think your pain and your heartbreak
Exactly.
are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you
But
read.
then you read.
It was
Yeah.
books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive.
Can I tell you something so interesting about the quotation? So I have seen that quotation many times online, and I actually went back into the archives to find the original source. And it's from a Life magazine interview. And I found a copy of it on eBay
Wow.
and I bought it. And he doesn't say books. In the original interview, he says it was
Really?
Dickens and Dostoevsky that
Oh, how
taught me.
interesting.
And I just found that so interesting. I mean, I think maybe he said it more than once and it was quoted in multiple ways, but I found the particularity of that choice very interesting. And I think about that quotation all the time in both versions.
I like
But
it better
yeah,
with Dickens and Dostoevsky.
I like it too because it's a little bit more specific or
I
something, but
think
it works either way. The idea remains.
I think Paul would have liked if he had mentioned Stephen Crane, I think. I
He
love
would have,
that book. Did you have a chance
yeah.
to read that? I mean, I loved it. I felt that the book itself was a course in and of itself with, it's sort of a course on how to read
Mm-hmm.
proper.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I luxuriated with that one as well. Can't get enough of this guy, huh? both of us.
Joanne Mort is in the chat saying, I love the way he connects to the delivery worker, ordering books he doesn't need in order to engage with
Right.
someone, putting them in a box in the back to give away. He has a crush on
Right.
on Molly, the UPS woman, and so
Right.
he orders endless books and then stacks them and gives them away.
He wants to
Yeah,
make sure she comes every day, right?
exactly,
It's a great idea
exactly.
too. Um, Rachel, I can go on. I can listen to you all day, first of all, and I can go on and on and on. If there's anyone out there who's got any questions or further thoughts, please, please let us know. This is a way, I think.
Teresa Hank says, comments remind me what's most personal is most universal. I think that's interesting. I mean, it is true that when I feel like when we're writing, it's often a very tricky balance actually between being particular enough to make something feel true and to make it meaningful, and also at the same time universal enough that it matters to someone other than, you know, your mom or your boyfriend or you. It's a delicate balance, and really, I think the trick in Baumgartner and in Paul's work in general is in the prose. The prose itself is so particular, and the experiences are so universal that he manages to have it both ways in a very brilliant and unique way, actually. But that's definitely true. And I also think about the effect, like Baumgartner himself is a very affectionate guy. He's a little bit cantankerous. I mean, he can be sort of colicky. One of my favorite parts is when he becomes irritated and bored by the meter reader just talking. They're just having a conversation. Suddenly, Baumgartner is suddenly just like, this guy's going to talk all night. He just begins to panic about it. And then other times he's so affectionate and fun. This young scholar becomes interested in Anna's work. And Baumgartner, because of their shared interest in his, you know, his ghost wife's mind, just loves her, hasn't even met her yet, but feels this enormous sense of love and compassion and worry. She's driving across the country and he's clocking her trip and feeling frantic about her safety, even though she's really someone he doesn't know. It's like this capacity to feel deeply, even when you're feeling things which are imagined, which I guess is the nature of being a good fiction writer and reader.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And so, you know, I mean, the book does go back and forth. So people who are out there, it's not just, you know, it's not just this one slice of time. He takes us back to the 50s on family holidays where you learn about his relationship with Naomi, his sister. So it does, you know, we mentioned it earlier, it plays with time and it does play with space. So you are out of his apartment quite a bit, or out of his house. Someone's asking, can you tell us if Paul is able to work right at the moment? We both spoke to him not too long ago, and I think he is. I think right now he's focusing on this treatment that he's having, and there are really hopeful signs from the treatment. So, you know, we're all hoping that that certainly something great will come from this, that he'll be able to continue his work because he loves, you know, writing is so key to him. You know, the book that he did right before this, which was an amazing, amazing book that he did with Spencer. It was the book about Spencer, who's an amazing photographer. If you ever have a chance, you should look up his Instagram, Spencer Ostrander. And the book right before this was a book of photographs with Spencer. It was Spencer's photographs called Bloodbath Nation, where Spencer went and photographed just the buildings of where these mass murders took place. And Paul wrote this really moving, remarkable piece, you know, about the effect of guns, you know, and, you know, a real call to action as well. And so he never stops. He writes, you know, so we hope that that he'll be back at it real soon as well.
I'm glad you bring up Bloodbath Nation. Thinking about those photographs and Paul's beautiful writing in that book reminds me again of the conversation we were having a little earlier about attentiveness and stillness. I had never, until I saw that book, seen a collection of pictures of the aftermaths, pictures of the empty buildings, pictures of the lots where these atrocities and horrible acts of violence had taken place, and the kind of almost like shimmering quality of spaces which had been the stages for these tragedies afterwards. And it's kind of, I'm reminded of all of Paul's writings I've read, and of Baumgartner itself, sort of the outlines of things and the things themselves, like what's negative. And he's always interrogating those questions, you know, what actually exists. Like in the phone call from Anna's ghost, in that section, it's all about, does she still have a mind? Does she still have an eye? What is a mind's eye if you're gone? What are things after they're gone? They're memories, but they're still something. They still matter. And I feel like Bloodbath Nation is a beautiful, beautiful articulation of that idea.
Beautifully put, Rachel. When you were reading it and Anna's poetry, you spoke a little bit about it, but how else did you, as a poet, as a writer, Rachel has her new collection that's out now, I think it just got published. How did talk a little bit more about your relationship to Anna, to the young Anna?
You know, I have to say, whenever I read a book which has its own writing in it, like the writing of one of the characters, I'm so excited and nervous to read the writing, because it's hard to pull that off. You know, it has to be something really particular, and it has to be either really good or intentionally not that good. And I would describe Anna's poetry as really good. It's lively, it's weird, it's particular to her. It doesn't feel like Cy wrote it. It doesn't feel, I mean, I guess it feels like Paul wrote it, but wait, I'm looking for one of the poems, which I can read right now. Where is that poem? Where's the flower, like the lit match? I thought he absolutely crushed it. I loved reading her writing. And I love the story. There's a short story she writes too about Frankie Boyle, this boy
Right.
she loved when she was a kid. And I'm not going to spoil anything about that story because it's plot driven and propulsive, but it's really, really good. It's a great story just on its own merit. And, you know, he really brings her to full three-dimensional, utterly rendered human life, the character and the ghost. Actually, there's one moment too where Paul's describing Cy, and he says something like, he was asleep, but he didn't know it. And that's one of those like virtuosic flourishes where you're like, oh,
Right.
this is Paul reminding us that like this isn't even a real person. He made this person up. Like Paul is there in the wings, like the magician, you know? And Anna's poetry, oh yeah, I found it. He is asleep now, but does not know it. He imagines that he's only on the verge of sleep and therefore has not lost touch with his surroundings. Totally amazing narrative moment, POV moment. And I would describe Anna's poetry that way as well. It's like, you kind of know in your mind that Paul is making the poetry, but you feel like Anna actually wrote it and left it in a box, and Cy has found it and is re-loving it.
While you're looking for the poem, there's Octavio Bueno says, I've read all of Paul's books and I love both his novels and his works as a critic. In light of Burning Boy, how do you see Paul's work as a critic shape his work as a novelist? Thanks for the great and insightful comments. Thank you, Octavio. That's very generous of you. And I don't know that I think I'll leave that for Rachel if she thinks she can tackle that question about his work as a critic shaping his work as a novelist. I think that may be the stuff of a master's thesis or something at some point.
I mean, I do, you know, my philosophy in general is that most really fine writers of fiction are also very good scholars of fiction. And Paul is an unbelievably good example of that kind of brilliance. And his reading is also just woven throughout all of his novels. There's tons and tons of reading in Baumgartner. I'm still looking for the poem, which I apparently can't find.
Robin says it's on page 52.
Oh my God, Robin, of
Lexicon.
course, thank you.
Thank you,
Saving me
Robin.
as always. I think, I mean, I would love to hear Paul answer this question. And when he's well enough and we do this again and he's present, we'll ask him, how do these things inform one another? And how do the genres help you with, the poetry is so distilled and then the prose is so efficient and beautiful, but propulsive and sometimes luxurious. I think he's working on purpose across genres, and that each of the genres includes the most essential and powerful components of the others. And
Yes.
that's true of criticism in the fiction. And frankly, his flourishes for fiction in the criticism. Like, his criticism is so readable and so beautifully written. Okay, here's Anna's poem. Thanks to Robin for finding the page for me. Lexicon by Anna within Paul Auster's beautiful new novel, Baumgartner. The little flower was so small it had no name. So I called my discovery the splinge, but then I thought better of it and renamed that tiny, tiny dot of brilliant burning red the "How are you doing, Mrs. Doolittle, and where have you been keeping yourself lately?" Inasmuch as the little red dot was a flower, it said nothing back to me, and therefore I will never know if it liked the name I had given it or not. I walked on. When I returned the following morning to see if the flower had grown overnight, the little red dot was gone. Where to now, Mrs. Doolittle? And if you are gone forever, would someone please tell me why that tiny imp of a man is grinning at me from across the street with a microscopic red something in his buttonhole gleaming like a lit match in the dark?
Mm, mm. It's
Great poem.
I know
Yeah.
it's a great poem.
It's so funny and it's so particular and weird and her. And it gives you her whole mind in that efficient little one page
No, it's
skinny
beautiful.
poem. Very
Yeah.
impressive.
Did you, you live in Chicago now. Someone in the questions is asking any comparisons with the aging themes in Bellow and Roth in this? I guess Bellow. Joanne is saying that she thought of Bellow when she read this book as well.
I had moments of thinking of Ravelstein. It seems
Yeah,
tonally a little bit different to me, but it crossed my mind. I mean, there's
yeah.
a genre.
I didn't see Roth in this. Roth
No, I didn't see Roth.
was very
A
much
nicer Bellow, yeah.
but Roth was never he never made any peace with getting older. It seemed like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
He was always trying
yeah.
to sort of forestall it by falling in love with every student that he had, it seemed like, in all of his books. But
Yeah.
you know, but and I haven't read John. Someone asked about John Fosse and John Fosse's aging artists, and I look forward to reading John Fosse. I haven't read him yet. He just won the Nobel Prize, but I'm anxious to read his work.
One of the things that struck me about Paul's depiction of late life was the tremendous generosity of Cy toward his own younger self, which is not a given, and toward Anna as a youngster. And the way that he thought of the two of them and their younger antics is quite loving and interesting and also full of wisdom, but it's not pedantic or patronizing. Um, he's not excessively critical of young people. He's very sweet. In a very early moment in the book, one of the many phone calls he gets is from the child of the woman who cleans his house, and she's miserable because her father has accidentally cut off, well, of course, accidentally, has had a terrible accident and cut off two of his fingers with a saw, and it's this horrible task of calling Baumgartner to tell him this has been delegated to her because she's the one home while her mom tends to her father's injury. And Baumgartner makes her laugh on the phone. He has this incredibly sweet conversation with this child who's obviously desperately upset. And then he says afterwards that tiny laugh that she finally is able to experience at the end of the call is the best accomplishment of his day. And I
Mm.
feel like that spirit of generosity is also how he treats his own younger self. And it's something really beautiful. And in my reading experience, really unusual. I don't see it in Bellow, and I certainly don't see it in Roth.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully put. And generosity and empathy, those are all wonderful ways of leaving this discussion. That's Paul, right?
Yeah.
We're all touched by him. We're touched by this book. we're so happy that we can, that I'm really happy. I hope that Paul's had a chance to see this, and I know that he will. And I know that he'll be back with us, where we can, maybe he can set us straight on some of these things. Yes, the book, Baumgartner.
Paul and Siri and Sophie and Spencer, we love you guys. And this book is stunningly, stunningly beautiful and brilliant. Vintage Paul. Everybody needs to buy it from your local indie and celebrate it with us. And Paul, next time we all gather in this little Zoom room, I hope you'll be with us to talk about it in your own voice.
Yes, we love you, Paul. We all do. And we'll see you soon. Sending love to everybody. And thank you all out there as well. And Rachel, I can listen to you all day. Thank you.
Fortunately, I won't require that of you, but I could also listen to you. And I really appreciate having this conversation with you, Mitch.
You
Christina,
too.
thank you for hosting us and setting this up.
Yes, thanks. And good night, everybody. Have a very, very safe weekend.